Good. Thank you very much, Brian, for the introduction. Let me begin with I hope this works. No, I'm not going to begin. There we go. A quote from Peter Armitage, where he wrote in a 1998 paper, "The improvement of clinical practice relies greatly on the conduct of clinical trials, and the promulgation of trials is stimulated and enhanced by lively discussion about their logical foundations." Peter's long-standing interest in the foundations of clinical trials is reflected in two papers he co-authored in his 99th year. They deal with the history and use of intention to treat and the issue of explanatory versus pragmatic trials. Now, I'm here today to talk and to highlight the content of these papers, and I'm very pleased to do so. But I do so primarily because Ian Chalmers, who was a key architect of these papers, was unable to be here to present them himself. Ian Chalmers, medically trained, was the longtime director of the National Perinatal Epidemiology Unit in Oxford, where he pioneered the use of systematic reviews of clinical trials. And in 1992, he was appointed director of the UK Cochrane Cochrane Centre, as many of you know, and that became the International Cochrane Collaboration. At the same time, he was also the founder of the James Lind Library, which is a remarkable historical resource on trials and other matters, but which aims to identify unanswered questions in medicine. And both these papers appeared first in the James Lind Library and subsequently in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine. That one of the co-authors was Robert Matthews, who's pictured here, Ian on the right, Robert on the left. Robert is the statistical advisor to the James Lind Library when they met with Peter during the writing of these papers. As editor of the James Lind Library, Ian Chalmers had been in contact with Peter regarding various historical matters. And Peter had actually contributed to the library, for example, with an article on the analysis of the evolution of the ways of deciding when a trial should stop, and a wonderful interview of Peter by Ian on that topic. He's also written on the MRC trial of streptomycin and its analysis. However, it's apparent from email correspondence that by May 2018, Peter and Ian had also found that they had very much in common outside of medical statistics and medical research. In Peter's latter years, Ian was a very good friend, and they enjoyed a warm correspondence as well as some good times together. However, from the correspondence in 2018, it's also clear that Peter felt that by then he would have little to contribute to new material in the James Lind Library. Ian is, however, nothing if not persistent in his efforts regarding the library. And the papers that I'm going to discuss indicate clearly that he did convince Peter that he could indeed still contribute. And I know it was a pleasure to Peter to be able to work with Ian and the others on these papers. Peter's continuing interest in the history of medical statistics, which I can confirm from personal experience, is aptly captured in this particular photo of him perusing Austin Bradford Hill's daybook, which he had not seen before, but in which he was searching for interesting tidbits. Ian had obtained a copy of this book, which fascinated Peter, but unfortunately, currently the book has gone AWOL. Now, in discussing intention to treat, we go back a little bit and talk about the principle of fair comparison of groups, which goes back to the 1800s, where fair is taken to be the comparability of treatment groups to be compared. The methodology for the creation of fair comparisons began to be discussed in the early part of the last century, and alternate allocation was often advised and used at that time, and sometimes, well, perhaps often referred to as random assignment. Formal randomized treatment assignment was introduced to avoid the potential for bias with alternate allocation or other methods. And notably, it was used by Austin Bradford Hill in the 1948 MRC trial of streptomycin. But other people were aware of these issues, and John Henry Gadam, in a book on pharmacology published in 1940, has a chapter which describes almost all the main features of fair comparisons. Quite fascinating. Just before we go on, just a brief aside on concealed allocation, because in order to have an unbiased comparison in a trial, we have to ensure that the pattern of allocation is hidden from those treating patients if that's going to affect their treatment. Obviously essential with alternate allocation, where it's quite predictable what's coming next, but almost as important with randomization. And David Cox and Peter Armitage early on stressed the importance of this, at that time advocating the use of sealed envelopes in trials. And Schultz and Ian Chalmers and some others have written a nice historical paper on the evolution of this term, allocation concealment. So, intention to treat. As ye randomize, so shall ye analyze, with Stephen Sen's very nice characterization of intention to treat in 2004. ITT relates to the maintaining of fair comparisons, because problems in trials arise through the differential exclusion or loss of patients in the different treatment groups. And clearly some reasons can be avoided and others cannot. It has been recognized early on by some folks, and Joseph Bell in 1941, with respect to a whooping cough vaccine trial, they had two randomly chosen groups. One was offered the vaccine, the other wasn't. But clearly some people who were offered the vaccine would refuse it. Others who weren't to offer it would find other ways to get it. And Joseph Bell argued that the comparison should be of the initially defined groups. In the early 1950s, clinical trial methodology was being much discussed, and obviously Austin Bradford Hill was a key figure in that area. He published a couple papers, for example, in the British Medical Bulletin and the New England Journal of Medicine in 51 and 52, both just with the simple title, The Clinical Trial. There are also a large number of American and British books dealing with trials which began to appear over this period. Most of those dealt with statistical methodology rather than bias control. So that issue was not as prominent in the early 1950s. Just in passing, I want to make mention of a paper published by my late colleague, Tony Johnson, on textbooks and other publications in controlled clinical trials between 1948 and 83. This represents a great deal of work, and 69, it's an annotated bibliography of the 69 publications that appeared over this period, where you see the development of books on clinical trials. So in the early 1950s, perhaps biases were not discussed very much, but a notable exception is the 1952 book on elementary medical statistics by Donald Mainland. He had a subsection entitled Intercurrent Events, where he addressed the problem of unforeseen events that may occur during treatment. And he writes, in deciding what should be done with data from any such patients, the criterion must always be whether their inclusion or omission would introduce bias. Unless the appropriate decision regarding bias is obvious, the best plan is to analyze all the data together. And then he says to analyze the special cases in the main series separately. And he expanded this discussion in his second edition in a chapter on lost information. In the late 1950s, the issue begins to get more prominence, however. So Lasagna and Paul Meyer of the famous Kaplan-Meier curve, wrote a chapter on patient loss for publication in 1959, writing perhaps the most common difficulty in a trial is the loss of some patients from observation. This introduces a new source of bias. There's no wholly satisfactory method for dealing with losses, and it's worth a great effort and expense to keep the number of losses at the absolute minimum. So the topic is becoming more prominent. There's some other early comments on it. Ian Sutherland, who's been mentioned already, one of the previous directors of the unit, wrote in a symposium on clinical trials held in London, the general principle that once allocated treatment, every patient must be accounted for in the results. He pointed that out as something that he was advocating. And then Richard Dahl, later Sir Richard Dahl, on a symposium a year later, wrote, once a patient has been included in the trial, his fate must not be omitted from the results. So the principle of intention to treat is being talked about, but perhaps the most significant event of this period was the fairly well known now, I think, 1959 Vienna Conference on Controlled Clinical Trials, a short record of which has been written by Sheila Bird. Peter Armitage gave two papers. At the time, he was invited to give two papers by Austin Bradford Hill, who organized the conference. He writes, though, the week was memorable. There was a beer garden in Grinzig and a harpsichord performance of Bach's Goldberg Variations by Ralph Kirkpatrick. Well, if you know Peter, then it's not surprising that he's looking beyond just the science, and particularly the music, which is obviously very important part of his life. He remembers the conference as having very lively discussion. There were 23 papers. Peter's second paper was on sequential methods. But these papers did discuss a wide range of issues, but several speakers dealt with this issue of bias losses from randomized comparison groups. In his paper on the construction of comparable groups, Peter introduced the topic by saying, however carefully a trial has been planned, occasionally things will go wrong. And I'm giving a slightly longer quote here to show how it was presented at the time, the construction of comparable groups. In a trial to compare the effects of radiotherapy and surgery, it was decided to include only operable patients for whom either form of treatment could be carried out. However, some of the patients allocated to the surgical group would be found at the start of the surgery to be inoperable. What do? Well, there's less opportunity to make this discovery if the patient had been allocated to radiotherapy. Therefore, exclusion of these patients would tend to favor the surgical group. For comparative purposes, therefore, they must be left in, although one would naturally wish to examine the results in the smaller group which is left when the unsuitable subjects are admitted. So note that balance, which will reappear later. An argument for what essentially is intention to treat. And he writes later, if a particular treatment cannot be performed correctly on all patients to whom it was allocated, the difficulty will usually apply in any future widespread use of the treatment. It could then be argued that the complete group of patients for whom the treatment was intended gives a better indication of the effect of advocating its general use. So there's the use of the word intended. Other quotes from proceedings of that same conference, Ralston Patterson writes, what in fact is being measured is the result of an intention to adopt one particular treatment policy rather than another, and not the result of a treatment method carried to conclusion. And John Nolden wrote, making here a comparison between those intended for treatment and those intended for control regimes. So we might say that around this time, the principle of intention to treat was being introduced. If we look back a little bit to 1955 in the 6th edition of Austin Bradford Hill's book in Principle of Medical Statistics, the only relevant quote seemed to be found by these authors were that every departure from the design of the experiment lowers its efficiency to some extent. However, in the 7th edition, published in 1961, just a couple years after that conference, he writes, unless the losses are very few and therefore unimportant, we may inevitably have to keep such patients in the comparison and thus measure the intention to treat in a given way rather than the actual treatment. So by the early 60s, the principle of intention to treat had been established. After it was introduced, there was broad support for our intention to treat, but there's some resistance. Schwartz, Fleming, and others wrote a summary of the Vienna meeting. And in that summary, they mentioned losses, but they made no mention of intention to treat. And interestingly, in passing, Austin Bradford Hill, in his opening and closing remarks to the conference, also did not mention the term or anything related to the term. A century, 10 years later, I'll get that right in the end. 10 years later, a couple of these authors, or three of those authors, wrote another book on this. And again, they didn't mention intention to treat explicitly, while they did discuss losses. And there continues to be, obviously, a lot of discussion about intention to treat. Some later criticism. There's a paper by Richard Feynman on intention to treat in 2009. This is a fairly harsh critique of intention to treat. The key phrase in the abstract is perhaps says, while ITT analyses can provide useful information in some cases, they do not answer the question that motivates many RCTs, namely whether the treatments differ in efficacy. So basically, very much critical of the concept of intention to treat and its aim. The paper does provide some valid criticism of how some ITT analyses have not been careful in stating the question being addressed. But equally, Feynman's suggestions for analyses seem often to leave the need for a fair comparison unaddressed, unstated, and it's certainly often not maintained. A slightly different paper by Shiner and Rubin in 1995 on intention to treat analysis and the goals of trials, they recognize the validity of ITT in the assessing the effect of what they call assignment to therapy. But they wanted to stress the value of estimates of therapy when they're actually administered. They say the trial should be designed to answer the latter question as well, but that the methods suggested, which I take to be the purpose of this paper, assume that a model-based adjustment procedure, usually for compliance, is sufficient. So in this paper, the authors also go on to look at how ITT is used, and they make reference to two papers published in 1999 and 2000 on a survey of how it's used and how it relates to methodological quality, leading to the following conclusions: that it appeared in the survey that only half of the trial reports actually observed the ITT principle, that intent to treat seemed to have different meanings for different authors. The analyses were often inadequately defined or applied, and there was no consensus on handling deviations from randomized allocation. In the investigation of quality, they found the trial reports not mentioning ITT were judged to be of lower quality. Also in its application, there's an increasing tendency to adopt what is often an undefined term, modified intention to treat. And that's been examined in a variety of papers here referenced. What they found was that trials that tend to use the term modified intention to treat were significantly more likely to make post-randomization exclusions, which is probably obvious. Interestingly, they found they were associated more often with industry funding and authors' conflicts of interest. And in the particular investigation of meta-analyses, they found that trials deviating from the ITT approach overestimate the treatment effect of meta-analyses compared to a standard approach. Having examined this literature in the James Lind Library paper, which Peter was a co-author, They conclude by saying that trialists who state that they have used a modified intention to treat analysis should make clear how they have handled ineligible inclusions, missing outcomes, and deviations from random allocation. But they conclude, however, there can be no hard and fast rules, for there is no correct answer to all situations, quoting there Austin Bradford Hill and his son Ian from the last edition of Hill's famous book. So that's the first of the two papers that Peter was involved in late in life that was to discuss. The second one dealt explicitly with explanatory versus pragmatic trials. Now, clearly there's an overlap here. Intention to treat is very much directed towards what would be a pragmatic trial, but they're stepping back a little bit further here, as you'll see. So they begin by quoting Marv Schneiderman. Now, Marv Schneiderman wasn't a close friend of Peter. They met during Peter's early visits to the US, which John has mentioned, and they published a number of joint papers on sequential methods. He wrote for a working paper for a cancer treatment committee that there appear to be two different kinds of trials conducted for distinctly different purposes. Patient-orientated trials, which address the question of how shall I treat the next patient with cancer who comes into my care, and drug-orientated trials, has this drug enough promise that I can bring it into patient-orientated trials? Or if I were to bring it into a patient-orientated trial, how is it best to give it? Now, you'll recognize, I'm sure, that this is very similar to the now classic distinction between phase 2 and phase 3 trials. And explanatory versus pragmatic is slightly broader than that, but nevertheless, this is an early example of someone highlighting the issue. Now, Schwartz and Luck, who, as you may recall, were slightly more pessimistic, if you like, towards intention to treat around the time of the Vienna conference, wrote a paper in 1967 where they looked at explanatory and pragmatic attitudes in therapeutic trials. And they used as an example a trial which compared radiotherapy alone to a radiotherapy plus a radiosensitizer, which is either a drug chemical compound of some sort that would enhance the lethal effects of radiotherapy. They say that a pragmatic design would compare patients being offered immediate radiotherapy to patients being offered radiotherapy, but prior to the radiotherapy being given a period of time on this radiosensitizer. They point out that an explanatory design, trying to look more explicitly at the role of sensitizer alone, or at least isolate it more, would introduce a delay in the radiotherapy only group in order to comparable to that required to give the radiosensitizer. And Peter and the other authors picked up another example, which they put forward in regarding a trial which was examining penicillin treatment for an infection. The standard treatment would be 4 times daily, 250 milligrams. They were wanting to know whether they could do it twice daily at 500 milligrams. And there, the pragmatic trial, the one that says, okay, if we use this in practice, let's compare the two options that would be used in practice. Well, the new option would be to have 2 treatment times a day, both of which the patient was given 500 milligrams. But option B would say, well, let's do that, but also introduce 2 placebo times of treatment, which are comparable to those corresponding to the standard treatment. So option A, the first one versus standard, would be a pragmatic trial, and option B versus the standard would be a more explanatory trial. In this area, again, in the paper, this particular piece of work is highlighted, where Thorpe et al. Have developed PRACY, which is a tool and a means of assessing how a given design, assessing a given design according to criteria which explore, this is correct. They assess a given design according to criteria which collectively capture the degree to which a trial is pragmatic or explanatory in nature. But importantly, I think, Thorpe et al. In this paper note that whether a trial is characterized as explanatory or pragmatic, and especially the two examples that I've given, the primary unbiased analysis of the trial should be by intention to treat. So I think this reflects the fact that if you're going to do an explanatory trial, you need to think carefully about it, which many authors are advocating ahead of time. And having done so, you would like to then be able to apply an intention to treat methodology. So let me close first with some remarks. Now, again, returning to Peter Armitage and the 1998 paper on attitudes in clinical trials, where after obviously all these years, he's writing, again, the arguments for the intention to treat approach. The benefits of randomization are maintained. The comparison is essentially one of different strategies of treatment. In this sense, the trial may be said to stimulate routine practice. And any attempt to measure relative efficacy by comparing groups of patients with 100% compliance to protocol is deeply suspect because of selection biases. But as John highlighted, Peter was both gracious and very broad-minded. And having said that, he also wrote, but it is possible to offer an unreserved welcome to model-based analyses of efficacy while cautioning against too ready an assumption that the need for ITT has disappeared. And finally, I want to highlight a recent paper by Richard Cook and Jerry Lawless, two former Armitage lecturers, on estimands in clinical trials of complex disease processes, particularly thinking of longitudinal trials with longitudinal data. They write, clinical trials are not primarily designed to clinical trials are not primarily designed to enhance understanding of causal mechanisms, but rather to robustly demonstrate marginal population-level causal effects. That would be consistent with what we've been talking about. But they say that therefore that we support treatment effects based on observable marginal features of a process. Comparable with Peter's comment, they support secondary, in their context, intensity-based analysis to provide an understanding of a marginal effect. And they continue to advocate intention to treat, which they refer to as a treatment policy strategy. So many years later, Peter's thoughts are being echoed by others and obviously very still relevant. And I finish simply by commenting how clear it is that Peter Armitage retained a keen interest in both the history and current practice of trials until the very end of his life. I thank Ian Chalmers and the other co-authors for working with Peter to provide an outlet to Peter for this interest. And I thank you all for listening.